opportunities are there. This is a freedom of choice, and we hope that the level of work that's shared, both publicly and privately, between men and women evens out. But some difference may exist, and at the end of the day, you have to give people that freedom.
I would just add one thing to that, and that is there's one form of power that women have probably always had and still do have, and that is the power to shame men. In World War I, for example, women gave out, in Britain anyway, gave out white feathers to men who were not in uniform. And this is it's a common theme in history and even folklore. So, I mean, the business about the expression of all the power is a very deceptive one. There are different kinds of power.
So can I just throw something out? Thinking about women's power, I don't know if there's a word for it or anything, but just the power of just some type of emotional power. Like if a girl was to talk, a guy was to listen, and a girl's going to listen. But if a guy says something, a girl will think it's like it's not right. It just seems like shameful to talk about your feelings. And if a guy and a guy talk about it, it does seem shameful too. You see it?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, right.
I don't know how to comment on that, but it's I think anybody has experienced that.
Okay, now a couple of things. First, unfortunately, due to time constraints, we're going to have to cut it off at the 4 people who are remaining to ask questions, and we're going to have to try and keep the answers fairly on the short side. The third is actually just one more point there is there's actually a study done at Rutgers on what's termed in-group bias, which is basically the tendency of people to behave well towards or to preference people in their own group. So things like race, class, all of these things. And what's very interesting that is found is that women possess a very strong automatic in-group bias and men do not. And what this means is that even a government that's largely male-dominated is not necessarily going to preference men for being men. It may preference, the people running it may be rich and white and Christian, so they may preference other rich, white, Christian people, but they're not going to preference men for being men. Government by men doesn't actually equate to government for men. This is really important because it kind of takes out the base of patriarchy theory, which is the idea that there are lots of men in power and they're very invested in empowering other men. So on to our next question.
I want to make a comment on that. You know, this women's in-group bias, I think that's pretty much a product of the last 30 years. Because if we go back in history before that, you know, women were separated by families and they weren't organized, they were in public space. So we can't generalize that women have always had a strong in-group bias.
Oh, that's absolutely true. We don't know how much of that is recent and how much of it is long-term.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Great. This answer could be really short, potentially. Just wanted to talk for a second before I ask the question, make a statement about this business of, it seems really amazing to me that in 2013 we have a situation in society or culture where certain groups are okay to target and other ones are completely off limits, right? And so you have a situation now, you can even look on your Facebook update page. There's certain big groups that you can shit on as much as you like, pardon my French. Like, for example, the Catholic Church. It's okay to say anything bad you want about the Catholic Church. Other religions are absolutely going to be in a lot of trouble if you speak about them. Okay, so the question is, given that we've seen, some great progress with regards to racism, I've seen it in my life. I'm almost 50 now. The question is, are you optimistic that we can, solve this problem and people can stop with that targeting and name calling of individual groups, including men?
Well, Catherine is probably more optimistic than I am. But there might be somewhat on the pessimistic side, at least to the extent of what I expect to see in my own lifetime. But nevertheless, I refuse to embrace cynicism. And cynicism is not the same as pessimism. I refuse to accept the idea on moral principle, on moral grounds, that everybody is only out for themselves, that there is no such thing as an altruistic motive. I refuse. And so, on that basis, I would have to say that ultimately, if this society survives at all, which who knows, then I think that we will come out of this.
So we what?
We will come out of this.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And you?
Okay, next up.
I'd like to thank you for the talk too. I unfortunately didn't bring my fire suit, but I didn't need it. The fire and brimstone coming from the podium wasn't there. But I can tell you, just anecdotally, the fear that I felt while all of that noise was going outside of me was fear that I felt. I've only felt 2 other times, and once was at a domestic violence conference where I asked a question about how many men had been killed by their spouses, and after that, the daggers on me were incredible. And the other time was when I was invited after a Barbara Kay lecture given by the Canadian Association for Freedom for Equality by a feminist there to come to listen to the U of T Law Society's feminist organization about how equality-driven they are. And that had fire and brimstone in it, I can tell you. And the fear of me being the only, not the only man there, but one of the few men there was incredible. Anyway, my question is, I'm not here for an academic lecture, although that's what you gave and I appreciate it. I'm here as an advocate for myself and for others as well. Can you give me a tool that I can grab a hold of someone in an intellectual way and say, this is a problem?
Well, take the National Post recording of reportage of the Warren Farrell event. If that doesn't encapsulate the problem, what will?
An intellectual discussion, an intellectual argument. To have an intellectual argument that you think is at the top of the scale, or close to the top.
For taking men, I don't think we're understanding. For taking men's issues seriously, what's the most important issue that should be out there? Right now, I think it's custody and to argue for the presumption of joint custody, which is coming up, I think, in the courts very soon. So that should be issue number 1. Right? I mean, there are other extremely serious issues, but if something is out there in the legal circles where there's going to be a decision, that's what we need to work on immediately.
One thing that was done by a person that I know, which is only semi-intellectual, but it was very, very successful, was to take a number of quotes from some very noted feminists and a number of quotes from a number of very noted racists. And everywhere you saw, and I think this was picked up, a few other people have done this, every place you saw black or woman, you replaced it with black woman, and you see if they can tell them apart. And it suddenly becomes obvious that the quality of the rhetoric in this case is often very similar. And they've mentioned the connections to racism. We look at some of the stereotypes that are perpetuated about men, the idea that men are coarse, men are aggressive, men are violent, men are uncultured. And these are very similar to some of the stereotypes we did see about blacks. So one of the ways is to just put it against other things that we now accept and we now understand to be very bigoted and very harmful and very wrong, and make it as hard as possible to tell the difference and then start to reveal it. That can be very helpful.
In academic circles, this is called intertextuality. You take a text from a male philosopher and somebody else, and you put them side by side, and then you read them together. Interesting things start to happen.
I want to add one more thing, although it might be to a previous question. About optimism. It seems to me that we live at a time when we can look back at the 20th century and we can see how one country after another tried desperately to stifle freedom of expression and failed. They've all failed, no matter how totalitarian those regimes were. So that does give me something.
Hi. Something you brought up during your discussion was the phenomenon of ideology. Throughout history, we've seen religious, political, and identity ideology. And something I'm curious about is why is it adopted by so many people?
Well, I think it's a trait of being human to create a worldview. You need to make sense of things, try to make them